Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to the Bible Difficulties and Answers podcast. I'm Lance Smith, and this is episode 262. Today's contradiction comes from the Skeptic's Annotated Bible, which asks, when did Jesus' temple tantrum occur? Now, I'll be honest, I cringed a little at that title. Calling it a temple tantrum makes it sound like Jesus was having a bad day and lost his temper. That's not what's happening in these passages at all. But behind that catchy title is actually a very interesting question. Did Jesus cleanse the temple once or twice? At first glance, it almost sounds like the gospel writers got their calendars mixed up. It's a little like four family members describing the same vacation. Three of them say, "Hey, remember that time Dad got lost on the last day at Disney World?" And one says, "No, that happened at the beginning." And suddenly you're wondering whether Dad got lost once, twice, or just never should have been trusted with the park directions in the first place. If you've read through the Gospels many times, you may never have even noticed this issue. I know I didn't for a long time. Matthew, Mark, and Luke placed the cleansing during the final week of Jesus' life, right around the time of the triumphal entry. But John places a temple cleansing near the beginning of Jesus' ministry. So which is it? Was there one temple cleansing that one group of gospel writers moved around for theological reasons? Or were there actually two separate cleansings? Sometimes we assume that if a dramatic event happened, it could only happen once. But that's not always true. If you've raised children, you've probably cleaned the same bedroom more than once. You don't walk in 3 years later and say, "Wait a minute, I already cleaned this room once. This must be a contradiction." No, the room got messy again. Human beings have a way of returning to old habits. As it turns out, a growing number of scholars, particularly conservative and evangelical scholars, believe the simplest explanation is that Jesus cleansed the temple twice. Let's take a look. In John's Gospel, the event occurs very early in Jesus' ministry. John writes this: "It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration. So Jesus went to Jerusalem. In the temple area, he saw merchants selling cattle, sheep, and doves for sacrifices. He also saw dealers at tables exchanging foreign money." That's John 2:13-14. John then tells us that Jesus made a whip from cords, drove out the animals, overturned tables, and declared this: "Get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." That's John 2:16. Notice a few things. This occurs shortly after the wedding at Cana. It is connected to an early Passover, and Jesus refers to the temple as "my Father's house." Now, compare that to the accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew records, "Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out all the people buying and selling animals for sacrifice." That's Matthew 21:12. He then quotes scripture: "My temple will be called a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of thieves." Matthew 21:13. Mark gives essentially the same account and places it during Passion Week. In fact, Mark's chronology indicates it occurred the day after the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Luke also records the cleansing during the final week, although his condensed narrative can make it appear it happened on the same day as the triumphal entry. So, what do we do with that? Well, one possibility is that all four Gospels describe the same event, and John simply moved it to the beginning of his Gospel for thematic reasons. Some scholars hold that position. But there are several reasons to think we're looking at two separate events. First, the timing is completely different. John places the cleansing at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Matthew, Mark, and Luke place it at the end. Dr. Tim Chaffee of Answers in Genesis notes key chronological markers in John, such as John the Baptist still being alive after this event, which point to an early date. Likewise, Eric Lyons of Apologetics Press argues that John's timeline should be taken seriously rather than assumed to be symbolic or rearranged. The second, the details are noticeably different. In John, Jesus makes a whip of cords, drives out animals, and says, "Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." In the Synoptic Gospels, the emphasis shifts. Jesus quotes Isaiah and Jeremiah and accuses the merchants of turning God's house into a den of thieves. Those are related themes, but they're not identical. Alan Chappell, writing for the Grace Evangelical Society, compares the accounts side by side and notes that there's actually less overlap than many people assume. The methods are different, the complaints are different, and even the reactions are different. He concludes that two separate events make better sense of the evidence. Third, human nature makes two cleansings entirely plausible. Imagine a business operation generating enormous amounts of money. Someone comes in and shuts it down. 3 years later, do you think those merchants would simply stay away forever? Probably not. Ligonier Ministries makes this exact point. The first cleansing could have served as a warning, but over time, the corruption returned. And honestly, history is full of examples like that. The temple marketplace wasn't just some little lemonade stand. This was a profitable operation. And profitable businesses don't usually disappear forever because somebody overturned a few tables. If you've ever watched weeds come back after pulling them out of your garden, you already understand the concept. Sometimes human nature is basically a dandelion. Clayton Crabbe, in his excellent article, "Did Jesus Cleanse the Temple Once or Twice? A Look at the Facts?" summarizes the evidence by arguing that John records an early cleansing while the Synoptic Gospels record a later cleansing shortly before Jesus' arrest and crucifixion. GotQuestions.org reaches the same conclusion, noting that the differences in timing and details fit naturally with two separate events. Interestingly, Phil Long at the Reading Acts blog observes that a growing number of scholars, including Craig Blomberg, have become more open to the two cleansing view. While it's not a majority position, it's certainly a respected one. Jimmy Akin of Catholic Answers also notes that the two temple cleansings provide the most straightforward explanation. He notes that John's Gospel often supplements rather than duplicates material found in the Synoptic Gospels. And this isn't merely a modern idea. Many early church fathers, including Augustine, accepted the possibility that Jesus cleansed the temple on more than one occasion. Think about it this way. If I told you about my trip to Charlotte, North Carolina, and said I got stuck in traffic for an hour, and then 6 months later told you I got stuck in traffic and missed my exit, nobody would assume those were from the same traffic jam. Similar event, same city, different occasion. So where does that leave us? The most likely answer is that Matthew 21, Mark 11, and Luke 19 describe a cleansing that occurred during the final week of Jesus' earthly ministry. John 2 describes an earlier cleansing near the beginning of that ministry. Rather than contradicting one another, the accounts may actually provide a fascinating picture of Jesus' consistent zeal for true worship. In a sense, these temple cleansings become bookends to his public ministry. At the beginning, Jesus confronts corruption at his Father's house. At the end, he confronts it again. The message never changed. It's almost like Jesus started his public ministry by saying, "This needs to stop," and then ended his public ministry by saying, "Apparently, we're having this conversation again." God's house was meant to be a place of worship and prayer and devotion, and not a place where religious activity became a cover for greed and exploitation. And that's really the lesson that stands out to me. The Gospels aren't presenting a contradiction. They're showing us the unwavering commitment of Jesus to honor his Father and call people back to genuine worship. Whether it happened once or twice isn't really the main point. The main point is that Jesus cared deeply about the purity of worship, and he wasn't afraid to confront corruption when he found it. If today's episode helped strengthen your faith or gave you tools to answer someone else's questions, I'd encourage you to share it with a friend. You can support the podcast at buymeacoffee.com/Lance Smith. Always appreciated, never expected. Every episode is available at BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers.podbean.com. You can also find us on the Bible Difficulties and Answers Facebook page. Or send me an email at BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers@gmail.com. I read every message that comes in. This is Lance Smith wishing you good health, good study, and God's richest blessings. We'll see you next time. So long, everybody.